And please remember to introduce yourself when you ask a question.
Start, if I could. Matt Masiello, thank you. As always, information from Sesame Street and the other colleagues joining us today is absolutely informative for us. I've been trying to create an avenue of questioning, and I didn't have the opportunity in our last session because of the many fine questions that were asked. But the question I raise is, how can we deliver this information or translate this information to certainly parents, and Sesame Street is an example of doing that very well, but also our healthcare providers. Our healthcare providers, whether they be family medicine physicians or pediatricians, are really on the front lines from birth, partnering right there with parents in trying to assist parents in preventing illness, but also developing these social skills. So the question I have, and for no one in particular, but maybe someone could jump in, is how can we translate this work that we're doing now to whether it relate to the media, specifically regarding newscasts, or to folks like those at Sesame Street? What can we give them? Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is Rosemary, that the American Academy of Pediatrics could definitely use resources that we've created because they're written for the general population. And so I think that we have to have a better understanding of what these behaviors are, and we have to educate the adults. It's sad to say that there are teachers and parents who don't really understand what these behaviors are, and I think that Larry's presentation was great, and they're responding to these news stories, and there's this overuse of the word bullying. In fact, there's a white paper that's going to be coming out from Child Trends, and their question is whether or not we should even be using the word bullying because it's so overused. I think the media definitely play a role, and that was something else that was talked about, and Larry brought it up as well, that the media have to start showing more positive examples of behaviors. And what is the phrase? If it bleeds, it leads. And I think that we're being bombarded with these negative messages, and so there's a higher, I should say, we're much more sensitive to these horrific stories. So, but I think, how do we get these? It's not just how do we get these resources, but what kinds of resources that are going to be relevant and meaningful to make a difference in the education of parents, professionals, journalists, and ultimately to educate our youth.
Yeah, if I can chime in, this is Larry. I think, following up on the previous comment, there is a lot of positive activities that take place in communities. And I have read and watched television news stories about programs that go on in some schools that help people basically, whether it's empathy education or social emotional learning or peer support. I mean, there's all of these great programs that are out there. Almost every school district has somebody doing something very positive. And that's what ought to be on the local news, and that's what ought to be reported in the local paper. Obviously, if there's a major incident, that's going to make the news, and there's little you can do to prevent that. But I think that around the country, we could be basically lobbying the media, using whatever PR skills are available locally to make sure that these stories get out of all the programs that are out there. I mean, the Trevor Project, some of the work that they've done around LGBT bullying is another example. Sure, they've pointed out some of the negatives, but they've also talked about some of the positive activities that people are doing to combat that. So I would really push for that. I would really stress getting those positive stories out there. And again, when there are negative stories, and there are and there will be, making sure that they have accurate information. And by the way, don't take anything I said to imply that bullying isn't still a major problem. I think everybody in this room, I don't have to convince you, you all know that, but sometimes when I do articles where I talk about how the media or how certain studies have exaggerated the problem, I get comments from people who say, wait a minute, you obviously have never been bullied, or you don't understand what my child went through. And that's confusing severity with prevalence. Severity means that some people have a horrible experience, and one can never deny that that's always going to happen. But the confusion between just because something is severe, it's therefore prevalent, that's actually not true. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Thank God the more severe things in life, you know, whether you're talking about medicine or social behavior, tend to be less prevalent than some of the less severe implications of it. But really, you know, again, getting the accurate information out there and getting the positive information out there, I think, is so important.
Great, thank you. Kaveri, I wanted to direct a question to you. I know that a lot of your work is focused on looking at the online environment and some of the developmental implications of being immersed in that environment, especially with developing identity and intimacy and relationships. And I was hoping that you might be able to comment on in what ways you perceive or that you've seen in your work that the online environment might influence or encourage or dissuade some of the bullying behaviors that we've been talking about. Are there things specific to the online environment that either foster or prevent bullying?
I think in terms of fostering bullying, I think the biggest problem is the exaggerated nature and the immediacy of the environment. So I think people, you know, a lot of what ends up being bullying sometimes happens because people are not thinking about it. It's just, you know, Control F and, you know, a minute, and then you're like, shoot, what did I do? Kind of reaction. So I think there's that exaggerated nature of online context, and then the disinhibited, the disembodiedness of individuals within online worlds, which, you know, creates a psychological distance between you and what you're doing on the screen that I think also contributes a little bit to the bullying. But I think that it's, and this is where I think media really presents this sort of double-headed hydra, because, you know, the very same features that create problems also present opportunities, I think, because when you think about identity, when you think about the, you know, the social compensation hypothesis that perhaps individuals who don't have a lot of good offline resources are able to, you know, go online to this new venue and find a little bit of support. Again, you have that same disinhibition that also seems to help with accessing some of those resources online. So I think what we need to do is pay a little bit of attention to, you know, the communication environment and the features of these contexts that perhaps might aggravate or make some of the bullying thing, you know, some bullying behaviors happen. And again, I think we really have to be cognizant to the points made by both of the other speakers today, that I think so much of it is just, you know, what I would characterize more as microaggressions, and I think it really gets, sort of mixed up with bullying. And there are a few individuals, I think, that are really much more at risk. And even within the academic literature, when you come out with research that suggests that well-being characteristics or, you know, depression levels might, you know, make those kids more at risk, even then there's a lot of what shall I say, pushback, because everybody really likes to cast media as the bad actor here. But I think there's more variables going on, and some of it is, you know, the identity development, the level of intimacy and support that these kids are already receiving in their offline lives. And Megan, I'm not quite sure if I actually addressed your question, but.
You did from my perspective, but I'd love to see if other members of the committee have questions.
This is Fred Rivera. I have a question. So for Rosemary from Sesame Street, are there any kind of equivalent programs for middle schoolers that are also trying to teach about bullying?
I'm sure there are, but I'm not aware of any that I can make a comment at this point, but I'm sure there are. Did you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, this is Suzanne Lemenestrel. I'm the study director. Megan gave me the okay to ask a question. This is for Kaveri and Larry. I was curious to know about some of the social media platforms where they're designed one to be anonymous and or designed to immediately disappear, like Snapchat or Yik Yak. There was a case at the University of Mary Washington, which is close to not far from where I live, about harassment using Yik Yak. And I know that the prevalence of use of those platforms is not as high as like Facebook. But I was wondering if either of you could comment on what you know about the instances of bullying with those platforms.
Yeah. I've actually done, this is Larry again, I've done actually quite a bit of work on that. I wrote one article called Anonymous is Not Synonymous with Ominous to point out the positive uses of anonymous apps. And on connectsafely.org, if you go to our advice and tips section, you'll find safety tips for anonymous apps, as well as several articles where we looked at them. One of the things, getting back to that exaggeration issue, is there are some horrible things that have happened on Yik Yak and Ask.fm and Whisper and Secret, which is no longer with us. These are some of the more prominent anonymous apps. But I actually did a little bit of a kind of an anecdotal study on Yik Yak where I looked at 200 postings, 200 random postings on a given day, and not a single one was blatantly homophobic or was blatantly sexist, was blatantly hateful. Now, I realize that was only 200. I didn't look at all of them, and I'm not suggesting that if you looked at thousands, you wouldn't have found some that were, in fact, hateful or homophobic or sexist. But my point being that the overwhelming use of these apps are things like reaching out for peer support, experimenting with things that you may not be comfortable being associated with their political opinions or sexual orientation issues or religious questions, or the most common was basically complaining about the weather. That was the biggest one on Yik Yak the particular day I looked because there was some storms going on around the country. But the bottom line is that there are a lot of really positive things that happen. Having said that, one of the reasons we did the tips for anonymous apps, and I'm going to try to bring it up real quickly while I talk, is that there are things that parents and kids need to know about these apps, one of which, if in fact you're not completely anonymous, that law enforcement, if necessary, can track you down so that anybody who's thinking of using these apps to break the law needs to be aware of that. And I'm bringing it up right now. But others, including understanding that anything you post could be there forever and could affect you, even though you're not. You may think you're anonymous. Being accountable, disagreeing respectfully, not using these apps to out people, understanding that people have feelings, and just sort of general advice, on how to use these apps in productive ways. But having said that, there's no question that there are issues, and unfortunately, with the exception of Ask.fm, most of these companies are pretty small and don't have good support staff. Ask.fm is an exception because the company, which was actually founded in Latvia and run very incompetently for a number of years, was recently acquired by Ask.com, which is a division of IAC, a great big corporation that owns Match, and they own a lot of web properties. And they hired safety experts. They actually have a full-time trust and safety officer in Oakland and another one in the UK, and they're working very hard to try to clean up their act and provide support. But the others are essentially startups, and they don't necessarily have the resources. But I'd be careful not to condemn them, but at the same time, I think people are smart to be a little bit careful when people are not necessarily held accountable for their remarks.
Kaveri, did you want to address that?
No, I think, so I sort of lost track of your question. I'm sorry, but I think there is this, again, I think as the earlier speaker said, I've been I think 5-10 years ago when I conducted a study in an online chat room, we again found, vast majority of the conversation was really about, nothing in particular, just about, everyday activities, stuff like that. But again, I think not to minimize it, you do have the occasional instances, but even those, even if they're relatively infrequent, if you're the receiving it, it can be pretty harmful. I don't think necessarily that the less anonymous ones are necessarily immune to these actions. I just think it makes it easier, and I think youth really don't understand that they may not be all that anonymous after all. So no, I don't have anything else to add, though.
Great. Other questions, or do we have any questions on the web or from the public?
We have one question from the webcast listener. It's from Dr. Melissa Mercado, and she says it's a question for Dr. Truglio. She says, during the morning session, the committee discussed the role of racial and ethnic diversity and cultural norms on bullying victimization. I was wondering, has Sesame Workshop addressed this through Sesame Street's Plaza Sesamo or other initiatives, bullying prevention content?
No, we've not. What we aired domestically. It did not get addressed in our Plaza Sesamo co-production. But that's a really good point, and that's something that we should definitely look into and see how we could develop a very similar storyline. To be honest with you, I think they tried to do it on Plaza, but they took a different approach. So it really wasn't bullying. It was more about helping children to enter a social group. But I think they attempted it, but they didn't fully address it as we did domestically with Big Bird. But that's a very good point. But my question is, are you asking about how we at Sesame are addressing racial differences and race relations? Because that's a different question, not necessarily linked to bullying.
It was a question from a webcast listener, so I'm not entirely sure, but I believe that I believe that you answered the question.
Okay.
Hi, Deborah Temkin from Child Trends. I just wanted to point to another campaign to your question for middle school students, which is the Ad Council campaign, which they do have some data that the committee might want to look at, which they started in 2011, I believe, on Be More Than a Bystander, which was targeted at middle school students and primarily their parents. So that might be a resource for the committee.
Thank you. Colin Fry, University of Washington. So I was interested to see that even with all the social media, correct me if I'm wrong, television still seemed to be one of the primary inputs to young children. And those of us who worked in bullying were kind of interested in the phenomenon of moral disengagement. This is the process by which young people or anyone will come up with justifications. Blaming the victim is a common one. Also pointing to how someone has victimized you as a way of justifying your aggressive behavior. And I was really surprised when looking into this a little bit to find out that screenwriters also use the term moral disengagement. The idea is that if you're planning to create a movie about violence, that you have to create justifications to justify violence and mayhem so that the viewer will feel okay about watching grisly things. And so making it a retaliatory thing is a very useful item there. So this is kind of a downer question. Are we sort of spitting into the wind here when we have when we're building a culture of media around moral disengagement?
I have an opinion on this. I don't know if it's an educated one, but I mean, the reality is that so much of television basically models bullying in all the sitcoms, comedies. I mean, even the show Friends. My wife wouldn't let my kids watch it because the way the so-called friends actually treated each other was modeling bullying. So I think it's endemic to so much of the media around us, and I think it's, you raised some of the issues. I think it's really important to keep doing that, and to put pressure on the studios to not necessarily avoid conflict, not necessarily avoid violence, but be aware of the fact that there are certain ways in which people who are perceived as positive on shows, right, the good cops, the positive role models, are actually modeling very negative kinds of activities, and with sometimes children watching.
I agree. I think if you think of a lot of the reality television as well, I mean, the one that really is most successful is the one that's harshest and the meanest, and that's just relational aggression. But I also want to point out that I think new digital media have really provided kids with ways of morally engaging back with their communities in ways that was not possible before. There are lots of interesting case studies that show this kind of engagement and even interaction with other kids living in other parts of the world. So I think, again, I'd like to see some optimism along with all of this negativity. So I think there's hope, but we all have to be a little more careful, I think, or more conscious of this moral disengagement that's so prevalent in media.
If I can add one more thing, our politicians are often guilty of it as well, and I would love to see politicians thinking about the kinds of activities that, how they're being role models. Of course, they have to criticize their opponent. That's part of politics, but they don't have to belittle their opponent and do such things that really show this kind of negative emotional relationship. It's just not the way we ought to be treating each other in public or private, for that matter.
That's a good point. And I could also add, Larry, that's really great that your wife picked up on that and had a conversation with you, and you as a family decided that this is a show that you didn't want your children to be exposed to. But it's unfortunate that there are a lot of parents who just don't have what we call those media literacy skills to identify some of these behaviors and understand that these portrayals are shaping the minds, the knowledge, and attitudes and beliefs of our young children. So, I'm going to put a plug for, why can't we address media literacy in our schools? Because I think that's another type of literacy, given the fact that we are surrounded by media content, that this is a skill that children need.
I agree.
Hi, this is Dan Flannery. This group has talked a lot about school-based bullying issues and age groups, and so I'm wondering if any of you have a particular perspective, evidence-based or not, on the use of social media in bullying incidents and what school administrators should be doing about these things. If the use of social media occurs, on a cell phone or at home, but carries over into the school in terms of behaviors or discipline issues, what we should be doing about that.
Yeah, that's a really.
Might have a bit of.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Rosemary.
No, go ahead. You go first.
I was just going to say I have a bit of a controversial opinion here, I suppose. It's just that so much of social media happens outside schools. I just honestly don't know how, how realistically school authorities can be expected to take that on one more. I think, again, as Rosemary says, digital literacy, media literacy, I think a more effective tack would be incorporating some of those content in the curriculum early on and helping parents to do that as well. I just think those would be much more effective approaches than having schools be playing cops and being a police person, if you will. Rosemary?
I agree, but can I just add, I think that more work needs to be done in establishing an anti-bullying culture in schools, because I think that some school administrators don't even know what that means, because keep in mind that if you are going to change a culture, the whole school has to be informed as to what bullying is, how do you identify it, what do you do when a child does, because we're saying go to an adult, go to a trusted adult if you're experiencing what you perceive as being bullying for some guidance if you can't solve it on your own, and most kids can't. And what happens is that if you don't educate from the custodial staff all the way up to the superintendent, you're not going to give the kids the help that they need. And I think that it's very difficult for some schools to establish what we're calling an anti-bullying culture and really do the education that it needs. And it's the school personnel, but it's also educating the parents.
This is Fred Rivara again. I think we don't have any other questions here. So let me ask each of you, maybe each take 1 minute and tell us what you would like to see come out of this report from this committee. Kavari, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm not sure. Hang on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No. Let me unmute myself.
We can hear you.
Sure. I think two things is really, again, I think the need for funding. In particular, I think we need longitudinal data to better understand the relationship both between well-being and family factors as well as, peer relationships and victimization. I think that's number one. Number two, again, I would like more, of a focus on digital literacy and media literacy. And again, the same, I really like the idea of having that incorporated early on. I think in our curriculum, I think the technology playing such an important role, that's going to be almost as important as the other literacy skills. So I think these are the two things that I would really like to see a focus on.
Thank you. Larry?
Yeah, I guess my first would be social emotional literacy in schools, starting at kindergarten, and media literacy, echoing what was just said, for kids all through school. Research literacy for the media profession, for journalists, really focusing on how journalists can accurately portray these issues. And I would say that something for adults, understanding that they're role models, that we have to make sure adults understand our role in this. There's a lot of adult-on-kid bullying that goes on, I think probably far more than most people realize. And we've already talked about some of the adult-on-adult bullying that gets portrayed in the media.
Thank you. Rosemary?
Yes, I'm going to add that I wouldn't just start in pre-K, Larry. In K, I would definitely address the social and emotional competency skills during the preschool years. I think we have to really educate the adults in children's lives, their parents, their teachers, their caregivers, and what didn't come up is sports. And there's a lot of aggressive, I'm not sure if I would say bullying in sports, but I think that that's another area in children's lives that we have to give some thought to the coaches and how they are interacting with our youth, and when it's okay to be aggressive or assertive and when it's downright bullying. So I think having a very clear definition for what bullying is, and there's a difference between bullying, aggression, and assertiveness. And so I think that is very, very helpful, because I think that these terms are all getting muddled, quite frankly. So, and it's not just giving kids these skills. We really have to address all of the adults in their lives as well. And I feel that enough is not being done with adult education. There's more emphasis being done with the children directly through schools, but it's been very difficult to get the attention of the adults and parents in particular. How do you get parents into schools to have these conversations? Because quite frankly, it's the parents whose children are usually the perpetrators are not showing up for these parenting meetings.
Good. Thank you very much.
All right, should we wrap up early? I think at this point then we've really appreciated your time and your presentations and addressing our questions, and we'll wrap up this panel. Thank you to our presenters.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.